Welcome to the Calming Book Nook. Find a comfortable place, soften your breath, and let these gentle stories guide you into rest. The chair by the window. The chair had lived by the window longer than anyone remembered. It was not the prettiest chair, but it was the one people chose when they wanted the world to feel softer. In spring, it watched rain sketch quick lines down the glass. In summer, it held the warmth that drifted in from late afternoons. In fall, it listened to leaves tumble like gentle applause. In winter, it faced the quiet snow as if it were a story told in whispers. The chair never asked for anything. It only offered the same thing every day: a place to pause. One evening, someone sat down with a tired sigh and no plan to feel better. They didn't open a book. They didn't reach for a phone. They only rested their hands in their lap and looked out at the dim streetlight. And slowly, without any big moment, something eased. The shoulders lowered, the breath got longer. The mind stopped running in circles and began walking in a straight line again. The chair did what it always did. It stayed, and that was enough. The library. That breathed. The library was small, tucked between a bakery and a florist, and most people missed it unless they were looking for it. The doorbell chimed softly when someone entered, like it didn't want to disturb the shelves. A child once said the library breathed. At first the adults laughed, but the librarian only smiled, because if you stood very still, just after the door closed, you could feel it too. A gentle hush settled over the room, as if the whole place exhaled when you arrived. It wasn't magic exactly. It was the sound of pages waiting, the warmth of paper and light, the careful way the librarian walked, like every step mattered. People came in carrying noisy thoughts, bills, deadlines, arguments, weather. They browsed slowly, and their hands moved over book spines like they were touching calm itself. When they found a book and sat down, their breathing changed. Longer, lower, steadier. And the library seemed to match them, the way a quiet friend matches your pace on a slow walk. When they left, they didn't take the silence with them, but they carried a piece of it in their chest, like a borrowed calm, like a book they planned to return but hoped would linger. Warm tea. After rain. After rain, the air always smelled like clean beginnings. The sidewalks shone. The trees looked freshly painted. Even the city seemed to speak more softly. In a small kitchen, someone boiled water and chose a mug with a tiny chip at the rim. The kind of mug that felt like home because it wasn't perfect. The kettle clicked. Steam rose. Tea leaves swirled, turning the water the color of comfort. Outside, the last drops fell from gutters with slow, patient taps. Inside, the room held its warmth like a secret. The person didn't drink right away. They wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat travel up their fingers, as if warmth could be an instruction. Slow down, you're safe. They took one sip. Not a dramatic sip, not a cinematic one, just a quiet sip that felt like stepping into a soft blanket. And in that moment, nothing needed fixing. Nothing needed answering. Nothing needed proving. There was only tea and rain that had already passed, and the steady understanding that calm often arrives like this. Small, simple, and right on time. The bell that rang once. The bell was old and hung above a narrow shop door. It was supposed to ring every time someone entered, but most days it didn't. The owner said it was stubborn. Customers said it was broken. But the bell had its own rules. It rang only when someone came in quietly, without rushing, without shouting into a phone, without carrying a storm of energy. On busy afternoons, the bell stayed silent. People pushed through the door with quick steps and quicker minds. They glanced at their watch, asked for directions, bought what they needed, and left again. But once in a while, someone opened the door gently, like they respected the air inside. On those days, the bell rang, one clear note, simple, bright, calm, and everyone felt it, like a small reminder placed in the room. You can enter your life like this. You can arrive softly, One evening, a tired person paused outside, took a slow breath, and pushed the door open with care. The bell rang once. The owner looked up and smiled, as if the bell had spoken a greeting meant just for them. No one said anything big, but the whole room became quieter, and that single note lingered in the air like peace remembering its way back. The path between lamps. There was a street that looked ordinary in daylight, but at night it became something else. Lamps lined the sidewalk in a steady row, each one spilling warm circles of light onto the pavement. People called it the lamp path because it always felt safe. Not in a dramatic way, in a gentle way, a way that made your shoulders unclench without you noticing. Walking there at night felt like stepping from one soft thought to another. The dark between lamps was never too dark, because the next glow was always waiting. A person who worried too much started taking evening walks on the lamp path. At first, they walked fast, as if they could outrun their thoughts. But the lamps didn't hurry. They waited, shining steadily. One pool of light, then the next, then the next. After a week, the person slowed. They began to notice the sound of their footsteps, the way night air felt cool and kind, the gentle hum of a distant city. By the time they reached the last lamp, their mind had quieted into something manageable. Not perfect, not empty, just calm enough to breathe. And that became the lesson of the lamp path. You don't need to see the whole road. You only need the next small light. A note left on the piano. The piano sat in the corner of a room that was used mostly for passing through. People walked by it with laundry baskets, phone chargers, half-finished plans. But the piano waited. One morning, a small note appeared on the keys. It was written in careful handwriting. Play one sound, that's enough. No one claimed the note. It was just there. Later, someone stopped. They had been carrying a heavy day already, and it wasn't even noon. They stared at the piano, then at the note, and laughed a little, softly, like the room needed gentleness. They sat down. They didn't play a song. They didn't remember chords. They pressed one key. A single note rose into the air and stayed there for a moment, warm and clear. They pressed it again. Then another key. Then another. Not music exactly, more like breathing and sound. The person sat there longer than they expected. When they finally stood up, their day was still full, but it felt less sharp. They looked at the note again and understood. Sometimes peace doesn't need a full performance. Sometimes it only needs one gentle sound, a small reminder that you are still here. The quilt of quiet hours. The quilt was made from old clothing, a soft shirt from a child who grew taller, a faded scarf from a winter long ago, a square of fabric that once belonged to curtains in a sunny kitchen. Nothing matched, and yet everything belonged. An older person stitched it slowly, not because they had to, but because stitching made time feel kinder. Each square held a memory, but the quilt wasn't sad. It was steady. When the quilt was finished, it was heavier than expected. Not in weight, exactly. More in comfort, like it carried quiet hours inside it. The first time someone wrapped it around their shoulders, they felt the strange relief of being held without being asked questions. They sat on a couch and listened to the house settle, pipes cooling, distant traffic, a clock ticking like a patient friend. The quilt didn't solve problems. It didn't erase worries, but it reminded the person of something easy to forget. You can be warm while life is uncertain. You can rest before you're done. You can wrap yourself in quiet and call it a plan. And every time the quilt was used, it gathered one more calm hour into its stitching, as if it was learning how to comfort one evening at a time. Snow on the bookshelf. The first time it happened, everyone thought a window was open. A small snowflake drifted down in the living room and landed on the top shelf of a bookcase. Then another. Then 3 more, floating like tiny feathers. But the windows were shut. The fireplace was off. The room was warm. The snow didn't pile up. It didn't make a mess. Each flake melted quietly before it reached the floor, as if it only wanted to be seen. The person living there stood still, watching. Their mind had been loud all day, full of lists and worries, but the snow made it hush. They sat down on the carpet and looked up at the bookshelf, as if it were the night sky. The flakes fell for only a minute. Then they stopped. The room felt different afterward, lighter, calmer, as if the air had been rinsed clean. No one could explain it, not really. But later, when the person needed calm, they would sit near the bookshelf and imagine soft flakes falling again. And strangely, it worked. Because sometimes the mind believes what the heart needs. A quiet miracle, a gentle pause, a moment of snow. Just long enough to remember peace exists. The clock with no numbers. The clock looked ordinary from far away. Round face, 2 hands, steady tick. But up close, you noticed something strange. There were no numbers. No one knew why. The clock had been that way since it was bought at a quiet shop on a quiet street. At first it bothered people. They tried to guess the time by angles and shadows. They squinted at the hands. They leaned in too close. But after a while, something shifted. Without numbers, the clock stopped demanding attention. It stopped telling people they were late, behind, too slow, too fast. It only ticked. The house began to change. Mornings weren't rushed as often. Evenings felt longer. People started measuring time by different things. By the smell of toast, by the sound of a page turning, by the moment the sunlight moved off the kitchen table. One day someone asked, "What time is it?" And the person near the clock answered honestly, "It's time for a break." The clock kept ticking, perfectly content, as if it approved, because time, it seemed, was never meant to be only numbers. Sometimes it's meant to be breath and rest and the quiet comfort of being here. Morning before the city. The city had 2 faces. One was loud, buses, crowds honking, hurried feet, bright screens. The other face appeared only in the early morning, before the noise woke up. In that hour, streets looked softer. Storefronts were dark, and streetlights still glowed like sleepy stars. The air smelled clean, like the world had just been washed. A person began waking early to meet the city's quiet face. They weren't training for anything. They weren't trying to be productive. They just wanted to see what calm looked like in a place that rarely stopped moving. They walked slowly, hands in pockets, breath visible in cool air. They passed a bakery where lights turned on one by one. They saw a delivery person humming. They watched a cat stretch on a doorstep, like it owned the morning. And in that quiet, the person realized something. The city could be gentle. It just didn't get enough chances. When the first rush of traffic began, the person went home, carrying that early hush like a pocket full of peace. They didn't need the city to be calm all day. They only needed to know it could be. And that calm was waiting somewhere, even in the busiest places, if you arrived early enough to meet it. The room that waited. At the end of the hallway was a room no one used much. It wasn't a sad room, but it was quiet. A small desk, a lamp, a shelf with a few books, a window that looked out at a tree. The door stayed open most days, as if the room was always ready. People passed by with their busy lives, carrying laundry, schedules, conversations. The room didn't call to them. It didn't demand attention. It waited. Then one day, someone stopped. They had been tired for a long time, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. They looked into the room and felt something like relief. They stepped inside and closed the door gently. The room was still. Not empty, just calm. The desk waited without judgment. The lamp offered warm light. The book sat quietly, patient. The person sat down and didn't do anything at first. They just breathed, the kind of breath you forget to take when you're always rushing. Minutes passed, then more. The person left the room later with the same life waiting outside, but they weren't the same. Something inside them had unclenched. After that, the room became a place people returned to when they needed a soft reset. It didn't fix the world. It didn't have to. If you let yourself, it simply waited. And in that waiting, it taught everyone something important. Rest is a room you can enter anytime, the lamp that stayed on. The storm was loud that night. Wind pushed at windows. Rain hit the roof like fast footsteps. The power flickered, and the house went dim in a nervous way. But in the living room, a small lamp stayed on. It was a simple lamp with a warm shade, nothing special. Yet it refused to blink out, even when the rest of the lights vanished. The person in the house sat near it, wrapped in a blanket, listening to thunder roll through the sky. Their mind wanted to panic, to imagine worst-case endings. But the lamp glowed steadily. Its light was soft enough to feel kind. It made a circle of warmth in the middle of the storm, like a promise. The person watched it and began to breathe with it, slow, steady, patient. The storm could rage outside, but inside the circle of light, things were manageable. At some point, the person realized they weren't afraid anymore, not because the storm had ended, but because they had found a small place of steadiness. Later, when the storm passed and power returned, the lamp still looked ordinary, but the person never forgot what it had done. It stayed on. It kept shining. It reminded them that even when the world shakes, you can choose one small light to sit beside and let it guide your breath back home. The envelope with no address. An envelope appeared on the kitchen table one morning. It was cream-colored, smooth, sealed neatly, and completely blank. No name, no address, no stamp. At first, the person thought it was a mistake. Then they thought it might be a prank, but the house was quiet and no one else lived there. They held the envelope carefully, as if it might break. Inside was a single card with a short message. Today, you don't have to carry everything at once. That was all. The person stared at the words for a long time. They had been carrying a lot. Worries stacked like boxes in their mind, always shifting, always heavy. They sat down and read the message again. Something about it felt personal, as if someone had seen them without needing details. They placed the card back in the envelope and set it by the kettle. They made tea. They took slow sips. They let the message settle in their chest like warm light. All day, when their thoughts started piling up, they remembered the card. Not everything at once, just one thing now. One breath, one step, one calm moment. The envelope never appeared again, but the message stayed, like a quiet letter delivered straight to the heart. And sometimes, that's the only address peace needs. The sound of turning pages. Some sounds are louder than they seem. In a small room, a person opened a book and began to read. The house around them was quiet, but their mind was not. Thoughts raced like a crowded street. They read a sentence, then another. When they turned the page, the sound was soft, paper sliding, a gentle whisper. But it felt important, like a door closing on the noise in their head. They kept reading, and every page turn was another small marker of calm. Turn and breathe, turn, settle. The story in the book wasn't even dramatic. It was simple. People walking, weather changing, quiet conversations. Yet that simplicity was exactly what the person needed. As the pages turned, the mind stopped sprinting. It began to stroll. The heart slowed to match. After a while, the person realized they weren't only reading the book. They were letting it read them, finding the places in them that needed softness. When the chapter ended, they didn't rush to the next one. They closed the book gently and rested their hands on the cover. The room was the same, but the air felt calmer, and the person understood. Sometimes peace isn't a big quiet. Sometimes it's the small whisper of a page turning again and again until you return to yourself. The window seat at dusk. The window seat was narrow, built into the wall like an afterthought. but it became the most used place in the house. At dusk, the light outside turned golden, then pink, then blue. The world shifted slowly, as if it didn't want to rush into night. A person began sitting on the window seat every evening. No phone, no tasks, just watching dusk arrive like a gentle visitor. At first it felt strange, doing nothing on purpose. Their mind kept offering reminders, things to finish, messages to answer, worries to rehearse. But dusk didn't care about any of that. It came anyway, painting the sky with patient colors. The person started noticing little details, a bird landing on a wire, a neighbor turning on a porch light, the way the air looked softer right before dark. As days passed, the window seat became a quiet ritual. It wasn't about escaping life. It was about meeting life without rushing. One evening, the person whispered, "Thank you," though no one was there. Maybe they were thanking dusk, maybe the seat, maybe their own choice to pause. And as the last light faded, the person felt something steady inside. Night could come, tomorrow could come, but right now they were safe in the slow beauty of dusk. And that was enough. The garden at midnight. Most gardens show their beauty in daylight, but this one had a secret. At midnight, the flowers seemed to breathe differently. The air cooled, and the world quieted into a softer shape. The leaves stopped rustling, like they were finally done talking. A person who couldn't sleep started stepping into the garden at night. They didn't bring a flashlight. The moon was enough. At first, the garden looked like shadows and silence, but if you stood still, your eyes adjusted. You began to see silver edges on petals, dark outlines of stems, the faint shimmer of dew. The person walked slowly, careful not to disturb anything. In the quiet, they could hear small sounds, a moth's wings, distant wind, their own breath. They sat on a bench and looked up at the sky. The stars were scattered like quiet promises. For the first time in days, their mind didn't demand answers. It simply rested, like the garden had given it permission. When the person finally went back inside, sleep came more easily, not because the world was solved, but because the heart had been soothed. The garden never told anyone its secret. It didn't need to. It simply opened its calm at midnight for anyone who came gently and listened. The staircase that slowed you down. The staircase in the old building was famous for one thing. It made everyone slow down. The steps weren't broken, they weren't dangerous, they were simply deep, wide, slightly uneven in a way that demanded attention. People rushed into the building with busy feet and busy minds, but the staircase refused to let them sprint. You had to place your foot carefully. You had to hold the railing. You had to notice the step you were on. At first, people complained. Then something changed. Climbing those stairs became a small ritual. Breath in, step, breath out, step. The body settled into a rhythm that the mind couldn't ignore. A person who carried anxiety like a heavy backpack began using the staircase on purpose. Not because it was faster, it wasn't, because it made their breathing real again. Halfway up, the person always felt lighter, not because worries disappeared, but because they weren't racing anymore. They were moving, one step at a time, in a way that made sense. At the top, they would pause and look down the staircase as if it were a teacher. And it was. The staircase didn't offer advice. It didn't give speeches. It simply insisted, be here, take the next step. Slow is still progress. The book returned late. The library had a rule about late books, but the librarian had a rule about people. One afternoon, a person entered, holding a book like it was a guilty secret. Their shoulders were tense, and their eyes kept flicking toward the counter. When they finally approached, they whispered, "I'm sorry. It's very late." The librarian looked up kindly. "Did you enjoy it?" The person blinked. They had expected a lecture, a fine, a frown. They hadn't expected kindness. "It was comforting," they admitted. "I kept meaning to bring it back, but Life, I understand, the librarian said and held out a hand. Life happens. The person placed the book on the counter slowly, as if they were letting go of something more than paper. The librarian scanned it and slid it into the return cart. Then, without making a big deal of it, they handed the person a small bookmark. On it were simple words, "Come back when you can." The person left the library feeling strangely lighter, not because they had fixed everything, but because someone had met their mistake with softness. And that day, they learned something important. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive like fireworks. Sometimes it arrives like a quiet librarian who chooses understanding over punishment. The fireplace without fire. The fireplace was built into the wall like a promise, but it hadn't been used in years. No wood stacked beside it, no smoke smell, just a clean, empty opening. One winter evening, the house felt especially cold. Not just in temperature, but in mood. Someone stood in front of the fireplace and stared at it, wishing for warmth they didn't have. Then they had an idea. They gathered candles, small ones, tall ones, half-used ones from drawers. They placed them inside the fireplace, arranging them like a gentle constellation. When they lit them, the room changed. The light flickered softly against the brick. Shadows danced in a comforting way. The fireplace didn't roar like a real fire, but it glowed. A friend came over and stopped in the doorway. "It feels warm in here," they said. The person smiled. "There's no fire." "I know," the friend replied, "but it feels like one." They sat together, watching candlelight move slowly. They didn't need much conversation. The glow did enough. And the person realized warmth is not always about heat. Sometimes it's about light and presence, and the choice to make a space feel safe, even without the thing you thought you needed. The shelf of unread books. The shelf was full of unread books, not because the person didn't love reading, but because life kept stacking itself in front of time. At first, the shelf made the person feel guilty. Each spine looked like a reminder. You haven't done enough. You've fallen behind. But one quiet afternoon, the person looked at the shelf differently. They saw possibility. Each book was a future comfort, waiting patiently. Each one was a doorway that didn't demand to be opened right now. The shelf wasn't pressure. It was a promise. Whenever you're ready, there is something gentle here. The person ran a finger along the spines like greeting old friends. They didn't choose the smartest book. They didn't pick the one they should read. They chose the one that felt warm. They sat down, opened it, and let the first sentence settle into their mind like a soft blanket. After a few pages, the guilt faded. The unread books stopped feeling like failure. They felt like kindness, waiting in reserve. The shelf stayed full, and that was okay. Because the lesson was simple. You don't have to catch up on comfort. Comfort will wait for you, quietly, faithfully, until you come back. The sound of a closing door. The day had been too much. Too many voices, too many tasks, too many tiny worries pressing for attention. When the person finally got home, they stepped inside and closed the door. Click. The sound was small, but it felt powerful, like a line drawn between the outside world and the inside. They leaned their back against the door for a moment, breathing out the day. Not dramatically, just honestly. The house was quiet. The air smelled familiar. The light was softer than sunlight, forgiving and calm. The person took off their shoes slowly, as if each motion was a message. You can stop now. They walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and listened to the gentle sound of it filling the cup. Another small sound, another small calm. They didn't rush to do anything. They didn't immediately turn on noise. They let the quiet be enough, and they realized something surprising. Relief doesn't always arrive in big ways. Sometimes it arrives as a single click. A closing door, a safe place, a moment that says, outside can wait. The last light in the cafe. The blanket that remembered. The blanket was old, the kind with worn edges and a softness that only comes from years of use. It didn't match the couch. It didn't match anything. But everyone reached for it when they needed comfort. It remembered quiet mornings when cartoons played softly. It remembered sick days and warm tea. It remembered long talks and silent evenings. It remembered being wrapped around shoulders that were trying to be brave. One day, someone pulled the blanket over themselves during a hard moment. One of those moments where everything feels too sharp and too heavy. As the blanket settled, the person felt something surprising. Safety. Not because the blanket had magic, but because it held the feeling of all the times it had helped before. Like comfort had soaked into the fabric. The person closed their eyes and breathed. The blanket's weight was steady, like a hand resting gently on your shoulder. Outside, the world continued its noise. But inside the blanket, the person felt held by memory. And that's what the blanket remembered best. Not the sad parts, not the hard parts. It remembered the way people always made it through. It remembered resilience wrapped in softness. It remembered that comfort can be simple and still real. The note between chapters. In the middle of a book, tucked between two chapters, someone had slipped a small folded note. The reader found it by accident. It slid out gently and landed on their lap like a quiet invitation. They opened it. It said, "Rest here for a moment. The story will wait." The reader smiled. They had been reading fast, as if the book was something to finish rather than something to feel. They looked around the room. The light was warm. The chair was comfortable. The world outside the window was calm. They closed the book and set it beside them. At first, their mind tried to protest. "Keep going. Don't stop. Hurry." But the note had given permission, a tiny permission, but enough. The reader rested their hands on their stomach and breathed slowly. They listened to the quiet. They noticed the way their shoulders had been tense without them realizing. Minutes passed, soft as falling dust. When they opened the book again, the words felt clearer. The story felt kinder. The reader felt present, not rushed. They tucked the note back into the pages carefully, grateful for whoever had left it. Because sometimes the best part of a story is not the next chapter. Sometimes the best part is the pause. The moment you remember that rest is allowed and the world won't fall apart if you breathe. The quiet that stayed. The quiet arrived unexpectedly. It wasn't the silence of an empty house or a snow-covered street. It was a quiet inside a person, something they hadn't felt in a long time. It happened on an ordinary day. The person was washing dishes, watching soap bubbles drift and pop. Sunlight fell across the sink in a warm stripe. For no reason they could explain, their mind stopped racing. Thoughts still existed, but they moved slowly, like clouds instead of storms. The person noticed their own breathing and realized it was steady. They set a plate on the rack and stood there, hands resting on the counter, just feeling that quiet. It didn't shout. It didn't sparkle. It simply was. Later, the person tried to keep it. They worried it would disappear the moment they moved, the moment they checked their phone, the moment life got loud again. But the quiet wasn't fragile. It stayed through small noises, footsteps, a kettle boiling, distant traffic. It stayed as the person sat down and sipped water. It stayed as they looked out the window. And the person understood. Quiet isn't always something you find outside. Sometimes it grows inside you. When you finally stop fighting the moment and let it be gentle. From then on, the person didn't chase quiet. They practiced welcoming it, and little by little, it stayed longer. Thank you for spending time in the Calming Book Nook. May the quiet stay with you, and may rest come easily.